bearing with me. Last week I was sharing with a couple of people that, I never really had that bad of symptoms. I just lost my voice. And so it wasn't really occurring to me. And I was having a conversation with my wife, speaking of wisdom, who brings a lot of wisdom to my life. And she said, John, you might need to cancel the class for, tonight. And I was like, no, I feel fine. She goes, John, you don't have a voice, And I'm like, oh, yeah, I might actually need a voice to speak for a couple of hours. So thankfully, I had in my mind, I'm not feeling that great, but hey, I'm going to muscle through. I wasn't thinking that you actually have to speak. So anyway, so we're going to pick up where we left off. So this is for class number 7. We're looking at the book of Proverbs, the doctrine of wisdom, and a survey of the book of Proverbs. So the section we're going to look at tonight deals with how Proverbs and how Solomon speaks into family relationships. And so Solomon knew that God designed the family and that each member has certain responsibilities that help the family run smoothly. When these responsibilities are ignored, the family suffers. Therefore, Solomon urges husbands, wives, parents, and children to govern their relationships and to act according to wisdom. So, the first verse that we're going to look at is Proverbs chapter 27, verse 8. So Proverbs 27, verse 8, and it says, people who won't settle down, wandering hither and yon, are like restless birds flitting to and fro. Let me change to a translation. I was doing my daily reading on that, so pardon me. So we're going to look at that through another translation here. So, King James Version says, as a bird that wandereth from her nest, so is a man that wandereth from his place. So, the first thing is that, in order to really understand the family dynamics and to walk through life with wisdom, is that you got to be present. You must be present to win, and we live in a time where it's so much easier just to take the pathway of least resistance and to avoid any type of uncomfortableness or any type of conflict. And so in Proverbs 27:8, like a bird that flees from his nest is anyone who flees from the home. And what it means is it leaves as the bird leaves the nest vulnerable. So when you stray from home, you leave your home vulnerable. And so it's important that we understand the dynamics of relationship. And there's a lot of people who anytime conflict arises or anytime that a relationship gets difficult, they just abandon that relationship. And one thing that does is not only does it leave the home vulnerable, but it also causes you to stay in a path of stagnation and doesn't allow you to grow. Because conflict, contrary to our feelings sometimes, conflict is not a bad thing, because conflict allows us to be worked on. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. So Proverbs 27:8 speaks into that. We have such a problem with people running away from responsibilities when things get hard. So in order for us to be able to apply the wisdom of Proverbs for the family unit, we have to be present. Proverbs 26:21. Says, as coals are to burning coals and wood is fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. Proverbs 27:15 said, a quarrelsome wife is like the dripping of a leaky roof in a rainstorm. Pause for dramatic effect. No. So it talks about, coming from both ends, that if you just bring up strife and you bring up quarreling, then what you're doing is you're providing an environment where nobody can flourish and nobody can grow. And so it's important for us to understand, as we apply wisdom to our own lives, as we apply wisdom as far as it affects relationships, as far as it affects the family unit, is to understand that there's a difference between correction, there's a difference between giving direction, there's a difference between giving construction and just quarreling. And so in order to be at a place where you can have the most fruit in a relationship, you need to understand that quarreling feeds itself. And so, one thing that I've learned through the years in doing counseling and just different studies and things like that is I realized that when people have that quarreling thing that goes on, so many times, and we'll see a verse that kind of backs this up a little bit later, but so many times all that is doing is that's just trying to mask and cover up some of the things that they're dealing with, and when people take a defensive front, I always have to wonder, why do you feel such a need to defend this situation? What's going on with you? And you realize that when you begin to unpeel that, people get angry because they're trying to distract away from the feelings that they're having. So, quarreling feeds itself, and a quarreling wife is like a dripping on a leaky roof. So far in Solomon's quest to dispense wisdom regarding the family, he has said, number one, that you must be present to win. And number two, whether you're a man or a woman, if you quarrel and you're just arguing, then all you are doing is hurting your family. Proverbs 31 paints a picture of a wife that is of noble character. Beginning in verse 10, it reads like this: who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. She rises also while it is yet night and gives meat to her household and a portion to her maidens. She considers the field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She girds her loins with strength and strengthens her arms. She perceives that her merchandise is good. Her candle goes not out by night. She lays by her hands to the spindle, and her hands hold the distaff. She stretches out her hands to the poor, yea, she reaches forth her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She makes herself coverings of tapestry. Her clothing is silk and purple. Her husband is known in the gates, when he sitteth among the elders of the land. She maketh fine linen and selleth it, delivereth girdles unto the merchant. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looks well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excelleth above them all. Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. So, the pursuit of those types of things, character traits, mental skills, practical and technical skills, these are all things that Solomon is speaking into a family that, okay, if we're going to deal with the family unit, we need to first of all understand that, a lot of the issues that we have in society today comes from abandoning the very first tenet of this section, and that is people leaving the home. And because of divided households, because of children growing up without fathers or children growing up without mothers, there's a lacking that's there. God created the unit to be as a whole. And so as a result, we're running into all kinds of issues because of the fact that kids are without the maternal instincts of a mom and the fraternal instincts of the father. And because of those things, or the paternal, instincts of a man. And because of those things, they're growing up not having everything that they need. And as a result, they're trying to either fill those things with other things in life, or they're not able to give themselves as a whole to a spouse when they marry. And so as a result, we end up with just generations of dysfunction because of the household not being what it was called to be. So here it talks about the wife and what a wife is, and that, a wife is not somebody who is just, a lot of times people in the past have kind of painted the wife and portrayed it as this, wallflower that doesn't say anything, that doesn't do anything. But that's not the woman that Solomon paints. He paints a woman who is considering land and purchasing it, who is strong and who is diligent to her family, but she's also wise in decision making. She speaks wisdom. This is the person that God and Solomon is pointing out contributes to the household of a wise family. Man's pursuit of a godly wife. Proverbs 18:22 says, "He who finds a wife finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord." Proverbs 19:14 says, "Houses and wealth are inherited from parents, but a prudent wife is from the Lord." The word it says is "from the Lord" is a very emphatic phrase in Hebrew. It implies that this gift is both beyond comparison and contriving. That it's not something that like you open on Christmas. This is something that is beyond our ability to understand where it comes from. If we recognize that God gives us the relationships we have, and that our responsibility is to steward those relationships for God, it will affect the way that we see people in the relationships differently. And so kind of to unpack that a little bit, when you see the word husband appear in Hebrew, you'll see, like, many times it'll say the husbandman, and it's referring to the person who's over the vineyard, who's tilling the land. And so that word kind of carries with it almost a master-servant relationship. And so that's kind of the early understandings of that. But then as you begin to unpack the original intent of it, that God created man, and, he saw that there was not a good helpmate, to man. And so out of Adam, he created Eve, and he gave Eve unto Adam. And so when you begin to understand the dynamics of that, and you realize that, okay, my wife is not my property, or my husband is not my property, or my kids are not my property, but they are a gift from God. There in Proverbs 18 and Proverbs 19, it talks about that a wise woman is a gift from God. That if it's a gift from God, then that means it's not really ours, and we're supposed to be stewards of what he has given us. And so how do we steward those relationships? How do we, think about our wives as somebody that we're looking after for God? How do we treat those relationships? And so that's the conditions of the way that the wisdom enters into the family unit. And when we talk about getting into the next thing, it's how we interact with children. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 26 says, "Whoever fears the Lord has a secure fortress, and for their children it will be a refuge." Proverbs 20, verse 7 says, "The righteous lead blameless lives. Blessed are their children after them." Proverbs 19:18 says, "Discipline your children, for in that there is hope. Do not be a willing party to their death." And the word death there refers to literally consequences of either capital punishment or natural consequences of living a foolish and reckless life. And so, what he's saying is, okay, if we structure this and we understand that, a man's supposed to, first of all, be present, and mom is supposed to be present, and that the husband should look at the wife as a gift that comes from God, and a woman should look at her household as her ground to work, that she is preparing for her family and she's taking care of them. She's out in the merchant world and she's making decisions that are benefiting the family. And that when we understand that those things are the beginning, then it begins to lay a foundation for the children, which is the way it should be. I've heard it said before, which is a worthwhile saying, that any natural birth is head first. It should come from the top down when you have something that is being birthed in a healthy way. And so same is true with husbands and wives, and now with parenting their children. And so understanding that the way that mom and dad lives, according to Proverbs chapter 14, is actually building a safe haven for the children. Proverbs 20, living a righteous life as parents, you're leaving a legacy of righteousness for your kids. And then in chapter 19, to discipline your children so that you're not a willing party to whatever punishment comes from that. Proverbs 22, verse 6 says, "Train a child in which they should go, in the way that they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it." This is a verse that I know many parents have clutched to, because this is a promise that's in here, and that if we do the training, and it's always interesting. Another little quote that I heard before that I thought was really good. Some people will say, "Raise up a child," and this old pastor one time, he said, "You don't raise a child, you raise corn. You train a child." And it's important that you realize that we are walking this out and training a child in the way that they should go. And obviously, when it's talking about this, it's talking about training them in the way that is following after the things of God. In fact, the word train, the Hebrew word, carries the idea of narrowing, as in narrowing the child's conduct away from unrighteousness. So what you're doing when you are training a child is you're limiting the decisions that they make that are foolish decisions, and gearing them more towards making decisions that are wise. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 12 says, "Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers all wrongs." That word cover is not a hiding. It means it overwhelms. So think of it that, hatred may stir up conflict, but love overwhelms wrongs. Proverbs chapter 11 says, "Those who are kind benefit themselves, but the cruel bring ruin on themselves." So when Solomon talks about discipline, we see that this is never something that should come from a place of cruelty. It should never come from a place of anger and wrath, but that it should come from a place of understanding that we are stewarding our children, that we're directing them, training or narrowing the decisions that they make so that they're making the right decision. So what we have to understand is that if you kind of come across the idea of the family unit, and you see mom and dad, and they're present, and mom and dad, mom is diligently working. Husband is understanding kind of the gift that his family is, that it's from God, and he's honoring his family in regards to that. And then understanding that when kids are stepping out of line, that it's an opportunity to train or narrow those decisions to bring them back into a place of righteousness and obedience. Proverbs chapter 10 says, "He who gathers crops in the summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps during harvest is a disgraceful son." Proverbs 28 verse 7 says, "A discerning son heeds instruction, but a companion of gluttons disgraces his father." And Proverbs 30 verse 17 says, "The eye that mocks a father, that scorns an aged mother, will be pecked out by the ravens of the valley, will be eaten by the vultures." So, when we talk about the family unit, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to a place where there becomes a generation of teaching that goes on, and that there's a generation of following after the statutes of God and following after the direction of God, so that when mom and dad are doing the things that they're supposed to do, that not only are they modeling that for the children, but they're actively directing their children, that when their children get older, that they don't make the decisions of a fool, but they make the decisions of wise, so that they can in turn be a place that they can be a refuge for their children as well. So many of the issues that we have today stems from the fact that there's just direction that is being left for people to find it wherever they may find it, and so a lot of family units do not have someone steering the ship. They're just kind of taken to and fro with the wind. And so what Solomon is saying to us through these passages on families and children is to grasp the reins and to follow after God with those reins. The word correction so many times carries with it a negative connotation. We think, oh, you've been corrected, therefore you've been beat down or something like that. But actually that word corrected is more along the lines of, if you have a horse that is going off track, that if you take the reins and you correct it back so that it's going down the right pathway, so it's not leading you off into a ditch or something like that. So we have to understand that correction is something that we've looked at over the last couple of classes that we're in. Correction is something that a wise person actually heeds, because it's something that they know will bring them more wisdom and will also bring them health. So when we think about what our family units are, this obviously is not all inclusive, but we need to look at these verses for in Proverbs 28, a discerning son heeds instruction. So it's kind of saying, a husband is supposed to be this way in the house, a wife is supposed to be this way. This is how you're supposed to hand down instruction, not out of malice or not out of cruelty, but you're supposed to hand it down. And then in turn, a wise child would begin to receive that. And that's not a letter of condemnation, because of the fact that everybody has different situations with different children. I have three children that range between the age of 14 and 20, and what I've recognized is that they've all required different types of training. My oldest, my middle one is most like me, which is, not always, the best thing. And, somebody will say, man, what has he got going on? And I always go, we're working. But I always say, if I can't take all the credit for the oldest and the fact that he, was a, straight A's, he's going into full-time ministry, then I can't take all the blame for the other one. I just have to realize that we lay out the pathway, and we stand upon that verse that says, train up a child so that when they're old they won't depart from it. So talking about the relationships between parents and children, also talking about relationships with outside of the home. And so first one is that we'll look at is friendship. God made man, and this is amazing, that God in his infinite wisdom, back in Genesis, he said he saw that it was not good for man to be alone. So he created Eve, and so you have the family unit there. We also read that, I said it a little earlier, that as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens another man. That God gives us relationships. In his infinite wisdom, he chose that you all by yourself do not have everything that you need to rightly worship God, that we need each other. And the reason why is because our view of God is going to be colored by our experiences, by our struggles, by our frustrations. Not that we end up with some type of theology that's based on experience, but we need each other to kind of sharpen the view of what God is doing. One of my favorite passages is when Jesus has died on the cross. He's appeared to several of the disciples, but Peter decides that he's going to go fishing. He says, I'm going to go fishing. And so it says the other disciples join him. And if you look at that passage, it says that they're out on the ship, and there's somebody that appears on the beach and says, have you caught any fish? Throw your net on the other side. And it says when he did, and the net was so much that they could barely contain it, it says that Peter knew that it was the Lord, and he jumped into the water, and he swam the boat, got to the boat, and this is the restoration of what many people call the restoration of Peter. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the relationships around him and around Peter in that passage, you realize that friendship does a lot for you, because even when you're not quite where you want to be mentally, friends are people that'll stick by you, that'll experience those things with you. Because the truth is that it's our walking out our salvation with fear and trembling looks different. And so we need those relationships. But, it says that John pointed out and said, it's the Lord, and Peter jumped into the water. And so, another thing that friendships do is it helps us identify when God's moving in our life sometimes and we can't see it. And I know that I've been there, and most people have been there in a place where you're kind of going through something and you're so in the middle of it that you can't really see God's hand, but other people can see God's hand moving on your behalf. So, and the last thing is that you realize that all of this is recorded in the book of John, which means John helped him remember, the things that happened in that on that day. And so that's what friendship does. Friendship helps you see God, kind of walks things out through you even when it's not pretty, and they help you remember the things that God's done for you. So Proverbs 18 verse 24 says, one who has unreliable friends soon come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. So it's talking about the importance of finding good friendship, but it's also tying into the fact that there is a friend that sticks closer than a brother. And obviously the friend that sticks closer than a brother is Jesus Christ. And so, walking out the relationships, John says to us that if you can't love the brother that you can see, how are you going to love a God that you can't see? that we recognize that walking out this faith walk has to do with the way that we treat each other, and the way that we encourage, and the way that we walk out the things that we find ourselves walking through on a daily basis. So when we talk about friendship and understanding the position that friendship has in our lives, then wisdom says we need to evaluate the people that we surround ourselves with. Bad company corrupts good character. I mean, it does. If you want to be wise, hang around people who are wise. If you want to have friends, show yourself to be friendly. I mean, there's this interaction between our friends. I always used to say that, guys need other guys, and ladies need other ladies. And it helps you to embrace and understand those things that you're going through and to speak through those things. There's a reason why Timothy encourages for, men to speak into the lives of the young men, and for women to speak into the lives of the young women. I always say that, men and women can be great friends, but it also leads to a place of sometimes people misunderstanding what those feelings are. And, I have men that I've surrounded myself with that will speak into my life, and I can speak into their lives. And never once have I misunderstood the relationship that I have with those guys. It's never confusing. I understand it completely. So, the last one section that we're going to look at before we take a little break tonight is we're going to look at our relationship with people that aren't necessarily our friends, and they're not our family. And what does that look like? So, it's interesting to me, and we looked at this a little bit a couple classes ago, but just to kind of dive into it, that there's a relationship that you have with people that, although the Bible says we war not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities in high places, that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty to the pulling down strongholds, that we're people that we encounter that do not have our best interest in mind. There are people that we encounter that, because of their own stuff that they're dealing with, they're selfish in their behaviors towards us. And so there's many times that the Bible says, well, if your enemy is hungry, give them food, and if they're thirsty, give them something to drink, because in doing so, in being kind to them, you will heap coals upon their head. Jesus goes on in the Sermon on the Mount to talk about how we should embrace the enemies to do well, to do right by them, and to leave vengeance up to God. That God will repay those. So it's interesting because when you're trying to define wisdom and you're trying to define these relationships, I don't know that we live in a time, because of the understanding the war that goes on in the heavenlies, where I can say, you know what, this person right here that lives next door to me, they're my mortal enemy. I'm going to treat them like an enemy. But what you have to understand is, you have to understand that people who are dead set against your walk, people who are dead set against your production and your productivity, they may not be an enemy in the sense that we line up with tanks and weapons, but they're an enemy of God's best intention for you. So we have to understand that when we have people that are like that, we have to keep a hedge around them. That although we treat them well, and although that we don't look down upon we don't rejoice in their iniquity, and although we don't embrace their thinking, that we take those times to make sure that we do nobody any harm, that we give into those situations so that they have the best opportunity to receive Christ. And that's the biggest difference with our relationships with those people, is that you always want to be in a place of being able to be a testimony and to be able to speak into people's lives. And if you live that type of lifestyle, that brings wisdom into your home, because of the fact that you're not in this constant conflict, but yet you're in a place of saying, I know that this person does not have my best in store. So as a result, although I will do them no harm, I'm not going to invite them in. I have people that I've ministered to that addicted to crack cocaine, and you know what? I love on those people, and I minister to those people, but I don't leave them alone in my house, because they don't have my best intention. They're too wrapped up in that addiction that they don't have the ability to have my best in mind. So therefore, as a husband, as a father, I protect my household, and I protect my walk with the Lord. There's also people that you encounter that are people that are not necessarily there to be lifelong friends. There's people that come in our lives that are there for a season. And so we have to understand that there's some seasonal people and there's lifetime people. And, there's people that I've encountered along the way that I know I wouldn't be where I am without those people. And sometimes I even miss some of those relationships, but I realize that God's just taken us in sometimes geographically, literally in different areas. And so as a result, we don't have that connection. There's a kind of an understanding that goes with, not only with ideas of counseling, but ideas of business and ideas of any type of connections and interaction, and that is that we have a circle that is only so big that is around us. And the reason why it's so important to have within church bodies and within congregations to have smaller groups, whether it's men's group or women's group or life fellowships or home groups or youth groups or however different churches kind of separate. The reason that those are important is because of the fact that our circle doesn't grow and grow and grow. Our circle is only so big, and if you were to look at your life, you'll see that typically when somebody new is entered into that circle, typically somebody kind of falls out of that circle. And it's not that you even have any type of grief towards that person or that there was any type of conflict or anything like that. It's just that our circle's only so big. And so as a result, what Solomon is saying is, who's in your circle that's influencing you? And you need to make sure that you're surrounding yourself with people. And if you have people who are enemies to what God wants to do in your life, if you have people who are enemies to your health, I tell my kids that. I say, if somebody wants to sell you drugs, they are an enemy to you, because what they're trying to do will bring you death, And if it doesn't bring you death, it'll definitely bring you heartache, and it'll bring you a long road of recovery. So you have to block those people out. And you have to say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to, key their car. I'm not going to, repay evil for evil. But you know what? I'm going to put a hedge around that person. And that person's not invited into my circle of influence. And understanding those relationships. This really comes into play when you talk about people who are living a single life, and they're believing that God's bringing somebody into their life. You need to look to see how does that person fit in that within that circle. Is it somebody who's coming in that is bringing you closer to the things that God wants you in your life, or is it somebody who is opposed to those things, and kind of labeling that. Let's go ahead and take a break right here. It's a good breaking place.